Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the beautiful Learning Lab here at the American Antiquarian Society. We're fortunate today to be joining you from inside the walls of the library. I am Ashley Cataldo, Curator of Manuscripts at AAS, and I'm joined by Meredith Neuman, Associate Professor of English at Clark University. Meredith is also an elected member of AAS, where she did much of the research for her book, Jeremiah's Scribes, which is all about Puritan sermon literature in manuscript and print. We're putting up some links now, I believe, to Meredith's publications, including a new essay on manuscripts coming out in November. So please be sure to check those out. Meredith is zooming in from her home. Hello, Meredith. But we are both coming to we are both coming to you from Nipmuc lands in what is now Worcester, Massachusetts. Just a few of the obligatory points about the webinar and the way we're hosting this webinar. We are hosting this as a Zoom webinar, which means you are all invisible to each other. But we have opened the chat, so please feel free to say hello to each other and to us and to share links and resources if you have them throughout the webinar. Please, though, reserve your questions for the Q&A. We've also enabled upvoting in the Q&A, so we can be sure to try to address the questions that are most interesting or most important to you all. With us today, we also have Kayla Hopper, who is Director of Outreach. You'll see Kayla and hear her at the end of the webinar asking me and Meredith your questions. So we'll welcome Kayla. We also have a couple of other staff in the room with us. So if you hear me talking to Nate asking for help with materials or the technology, you'll know exactly what I'm doing. So Meredith, over to you.
Well, not surprisingly, when Ashley and I get together and talk about showing people manuscripts, we come up with infinite or seemingly infinite lists. We whittle it down to 40, we whittle it down to 20, and today we whittled it down to 4 that we're going to try to show you. And the theme that really connects them all is to think about ways that manuscripts convey meaning that goes beyond transcribable content. In other words, in manuscript studies, people sometimes talk about diplomatic translation, which is a set of conventions where you can transcribe text. So it's sort of easy to read, and this is really valuable. But Ashley and I are both very interested in other ways that manuscripts create meaning and avenues for interpretation. Back to you, Ashley.
All right, great. So as Meredith said, we're focusing on 4 objects today. And our first object is correspondence. Correspondence is one area where you expect to find manuscript content in the 17th century. And this letter, let's switch to the dot cam, Nate, if we can. This letter here that we'll be pulling up in a second is from 1676. It's March of 1676. So those of you who are familiar with the contours of New England history from this period know that we're about a half a year into what is now commonly called King Philip's War. In this letter, Noah Neuman is writing to John Cotton Jr. Neuman is a minister in Rehoboth, Mass., and he's writing to Cotton, who is a minister in Plymouth. For those of you who, again, are familiar with the history from this period, you'll know that Cotton had been a missionary to the Wampanoags on Martha's Vineyard. And so in this letter, at Cotton's request, Neuman writes about the tragedy, as he calls it, in Medfield, Mass. At the end of February of 1676. And this was when Nipmucs, who were at war with the English and had allied with other tribes like the Nashaway and the Narragansett, surprised Medfield residents on the morning of that day in February. And this is from the Kerwin family papers at AAS. So if we want to put the link up to the collection. Now, I'll just read a little bit of this letter. It's an incredibly violent text, so I just want to read a portion of it. And what Neuman says is, as to your desire of the history of the Medfield tragedy, as you well call it, I shall give you the best account I can. The time of it was February the 21st. It seems probable that the enemy had lodged himself secretly in most of their barns and waited for the first appearance of day, intending to take persons at their first looking out at their doors in the morning, which accordingly they did. The Indians bounced at Goodman Dwight's house to provoke him to look out, and when he did look out, shot him through the shoulder. At Widow Fisher's, Joshua Fisher, her grandson, going out the door was shot at, the bullet passing through some flesh about his collarbone. The enemy, as Mr. Wilson told me, he thought was something surprised with their great guns, and such a number of men which they perceived was amongst them, and therefore gave their watchwords to draw off. So the Nipmucs are retreating. Their passage away was over Bridge Street Bridge, which they fired. or set on fire, and for a while encamped on the other side, and from thence passed away. A writing was found at the foot of the bridge with this imposed in Quaker language. And if we can zoom in, I'm just going to zoom in here on the passage. See if we can get it. It's right about here. Thou Englishmen hath provoked us to anger and wrath, and we care not, though we have war with thee this 21 years. For there are many of us, 300 of which hath fought with thee at this time. We have nothing but our lives to lose, and thou hast many fair cattle, houses, and much good things. And this whole passage is right here. And let me see if I can zoom in just a little more so you can get a close-up look of that. So this letter is interesting to scholars and people like Jill Lepore and Lisa Brooks, because this, and we'll put up a link to Lisa Brooks's website, the companion website to her Bancroft Award-winning book, Our Beloved Kin, because this text preserves a text of resistance. This very violent text preserves a text of resistance. Neuman transcribes that note that was found on the bridge in Medfield, a note that was likely written by a Nipmuc printer and scribe, James Printer. Printer was, again, a Nipmuc who helped to print what is commonly called the Eliot Indian Bible. It was the first Bible printed in British North America. Unfortunately, yes, this note, which was on a bridge that was set afire, is no longer extant, but the transcription is extant in this letter. So as part of our efforts to understand manuscripts from this period, we also try to understand the various ways that technologies of writing and Western expectations of literacy unwitnessed, and this is a word that Drew Lopenzina, a scholar of Indigenous literary history, uses frequently, the ways that these manuscripts unwitness Indigenous cultures. The story of 17th century New England is a story of Indigenous English relations, and the written record is one way we can access those stories. So, in other words, this letter does acknowledge the very violent actions of war from the colonist perspective, but it does not acknowledge and it does not witness the sort of embedded violence of settler colonialism. And we preserve these acts of unwitnessing in our archives today. So now I'm going to switch to the content that is not transcribable. If we look at the paper, I'm actually going to use a light pad here. Unfortunately, the letter, which I just showed you, does not have a watermark. A watermark is a design that was embedded in the paper mold when the paper was made, and oftentimes a watermark can help us identify where paper was produced. This letter, however, also from Noah Neuman, has a countermark. Again, that's the corresponding mark on a paper mold. And it's sort of difficult to read, but it has the religious monogram IHS. And this is a countermark that is found frequently in paper from continental Europe. And so this letter confirms, or this paper confirms what we already know, that much writing paper, in fact, all writing paper, was imported from Europe, probably traveled from continental Europe through England into the colonies. Also, in looking at this letter, I'm going to take the light pad away now. We can observe that there was a very intimate relationship with the natural world. The ink that was used to write this letter was made with oak galls or oak nuts, those tiny nests for baby wasps, and also iron salts. The quill that would have been used to write this letter, and I'll hold this up under the dot cam, hopefully you can see that. Might take a second. This quill is actually from a collection from the 19th century, but you get the idea. Quills like this would have been, again, harvested from geese or swans and hardened and cut by a sort of pen cutter, nib cutter, to produce a tip. Also, when we look at this letter, we see the more transcribable content, but the transcribable content here indicates a movement through space and time. And so if you can read this, I'll try to zoom in again. This is an address to John Cotton. Right here in the center here, you can see how the letter would have been folded. I will not reenact the folding of the letter so as to help preserve the material. But the letter here, what's that, Meredith?
Thank you for not folding the manuscript.
You are welcome. So this is the address to Cotton in Plymouth, and we know that Cotton wrote back to Neuman about 6 days later. Likely the letter would have traveled along the post road from Rehoboth to Plymouth. And again, Cotton is replying 6 days later. Here we have the endorsement. This is from Mr. Neuman, March 14, 1676, and then it also says Indian assault. And this would have helped, this letter would have been folded in a slightly different way and filed either in a chest or a secretary desk. And this endorsement would have been likely sticking out and visible so that the filing and accessing the letter would have been much simpler for Cotton as he was going back through his correspondence. And just one other point, the hand that we see here, or the style of handwriting, is this really a sign of elite white male training. In Connecticut in 1656, the sort of general laws of the colony stated that boys and girls could learn to read, but in 1660, it was determined that only boys could be trained in writing. And so here we see sort of a combination of secretary and italic letter forms, but again, a sign of relatively, again, elite white Western training. So Meredith, would you like to move on to the next object? I think we have the sermons.
Speaking of sort of elite,
Yeah.
So can you zoom out?
Yep.
Let's just look at the full object.
Yep.
Look at the page spread. So my first book was about sermon notebooks. These would be notes that people took when they were listening to sermons in the meeting house. And there was a practice that came from England and the continent where people would write notes. This is a lovely, lovely object. It's very big. If you look at the inside of Ashley holding it, you can see it's almost the size of a sort of a family Bible. It's not exactly an easy notebook to kind of carry around with you, but this seems to be who the owner, Richard Russell, took sermon notes in it. So I'll have some wonderful, interesting sort of damage. You'll see a little bit of pen testing, names, torn leaves, all these things that suggest the object has sort of gone through time, has become a very used, very familiar object. But if we go in to look at the particular way that Richard Russell is recording these sermons, one of the things that we're going to see is that along either side of each page, and then at the top and at the bottom, there are these rules that go, right? So that you have a left margin preserved, a right margin preserved, a little bit at the head and a little bit at the foot. And in that sort of space, that square space in the middle, that is where Richard originally intends to sort of write in the text of the sermon that he's heard. On the left, for example, you'll see the sort of the branching of the sermon, the different points that the minister is bringing up. Over on the right-hand margin, you'll see a recording of the minister who's giving it. You'll see scriptural citations. And here, it's a kind of a fluid conventions that move from manuscript into print conventions, and then again back into manuscript conventions. What we see as he continues to go through, and actually, would it be possible for you to turn that book upside down, go back to the page you were just on? Perfect. So when Ashley was positioning this under the document camera earlier, I think it was Nate or Nick said, "Oh, you've got it upside down," and then Kayla said, "No, it looks right to me." And in fact, you'll see that part of the page is running one direction and part is upside down. This is because what Richard Russell is doing is in one direction, the direction which is now upside down to you, that is where he takes notes on a Sunday morning from the minister Zechariah Sims. Might go home and have some lunch, comes back and then turns it again, and then in the afternoon will record the minister Thomas Allen. And so one direction of the book would be called part one, one direction of the book would be called part two. So in a sense, in one book object, Russell is able to take notes in both directions, and they meet in the middle. Mm-hmm. If you just pause there for a moment, Ashley, what you'll see also is that over time, as Russell slowly accumulates his notes Sunday after Sunday as he's taking notes on these sermons he hears, he lapses over more and more, especially into the right-hand margin. In other words, he becomes increasingly interested in recording the sort of the full text, more or less, of what he hears, rather than saving space for those scriptural citations that all kind of get shoved over into the left margin. You see additional kinds of writing in the lower left-hand corner in what to us is currently the left-hand margin. Is that shorthand?
That is right up here, yep.
Yeah.
Do you want me to turn it around?
Sure, not that any of us can read it anyway. Probably. So then we see a kind of an evolution over time in the way that Richard Russell is recording these notes, the kind of supplementary material that he's coming back to put in. Here it looks like the shorthand is some sort of supplement to the sermon that he's writing in the main square. In other places, we can see where he mixes a regular sort of English semi-secretary hand with a bit of shorthand notation. Shorthand would conserve both space and time, but we see it being quite fluid in a lot of these kinds of notebooks. Those of you who are interested in learning more about shorthand, I'd recommend some work by David Powers, who's transcribed many, many sermons taken by John Pynchon in this period. These shorthand systems, there were a lot available in the 17th century. More often than not, it seems that individual note takers would adapt the shorthand to their particular idiosyncratic style.
I'm just gonna,
Yes, this is a small, and you can see the difference. Put your hand right by that, Ashley. You can see the difference in size. These would be sermon notes that John Pynchon is taking more or less as a teenager, and you see that mix of sort of English letters and shorthand letters that allows him to write.
I'll just leave it up there for a moment.
A couple of Greek notes in there as well. Very often these notebooks would be multi-use, right? So you might find some accounts in there, or the draft of a letter, for example, sometimes even little bits of verses. Very briefly, Ashley, can we see the Daniel Russell? Yep. So that large book by Richard Russell probably is very different than what we see his son recording in later on. This sort of oblong style notebook. Notice how small the son Daniel's left margin is. He barely has room to put in those notations. And also look at how easy it is with this kind of, what I always think is kind of a stenopad or a 20th century reporter's notebook, right? It really allows Daniel Russell to write sort of almost the entire width of the paper. Mm-hmm. These are probably notes that he had of his own sermons. Mm-hmm. The father, Richard, was a merchant, and you could see some of the aspirations in that physical object of the book manuscript. Here with the son, we see a much more sort of practical workaday notebook, which is entirely dedicated to this one direction of sermons. All right.
All right. Great.
Nate, you can take us back to the widescreen.
Yes, thank you. So in our description of our webinar, we said that we would talk about a number of different types of materials. And again, as Meredith was saying, as we got to talking, we realized we couldn't talk about everything. But I have a lot of different objects in front of me that I'd like to go over just briefly so you get a sense of what kinds of manuscript material was being produced throughout the century. As you can imagine, with the printing press having been begun in Cambridge in the 1630s and in Virginia in the 1670s, we have quite a bit of material that was produced in manuscript in this period. So here I'm holding a small diary that was kept by Increase Mather in the 1680s. The Mather family papers, we won't be talking about too much today, but they're one of the largest manuscript collections at AAS, and probably one of the most important, having been one of the first purchases / gifts to Isaiah Thomas back in the 18 teens. But this diary is a blank book. Again, most diaries you'll see from this period are small blank books. Many diaries as well will include accounts, and I'm just sort of holding this up, but the end of Increase Mather's diary, you'll see accounts in almost every volume. And so diaries are often complex volumes with a lot of miscellaneous content. And I'm just going to hold this up briefly. I hope you can see it. This is an almanac from 1670. Many diaries as well throughout the 17th and 18th centuries were kept in interleaved almanacs, which means that the printed almanac sort of had blank leaves bound in or sewed in or stabbed in, and the diary keeper would keep notes on the weather, on daily activities. Usually those almanac diaries are very brief. We also have court records. So here I have the court records from Hampshire County. AAS has the 1660s and 1670s Hampshire County court records. I won't open up the volume, it is quite delicate. And here in a volume that's been rebound, we have the notes of who we believe was the first lawyer in Massachusetts, Thomas Letchford. This volume again is very delicate. I won't do too much opening, but Letchford was also a scrivener, which means he would make copies of legal documents, and we have many copies of legal documents in that volume as well. We have indentures and deeds. We'll be talking about a deed a little bit later in the, oops, I'm actually going to hold this up on the folder. This is an indenture. So this is a indenture for an apprenticeship.
Just hold it up and let Nate.
Oh, sure. Oh, that's great. This is a 1669 indenture. And I want to be very careful with this, but for someone in Massachusetts who was coming over again in the 1660s and was apprenticed for about a period of 7 years. It's Thomas Austin. We also have letter books. So this is a disc-bound letter book from John Hull. Again, we'll be talking about John Hull a little bit later. This letter book was kept by Hull throughout the 1670s. A lot of the material we have out today is from that King Philip's War period. But Hull is perhaps best known as the mint master, a treasurer in Massachusetts. He produced some of the first coinage, and this letter book has appeared in a variety of works on slavery of indigenous people from New England. Hull talks about the trade in slaves in his letter book. And letter books, again, I believe I said, were kept by Correspondence so that they could keep a copy of their correspondence for future reference. We also have things like church records. So this is a volume of Ipswich, Mass church records. I'm sorry. You'll often find important vital records in manuscript in volumes like this. And I don't really want to open it up too much, but you can also find some scandalous records of church expulsions as well. So they're always fun to dig into if you can read them. We have notebooks. Meredith mentioned sermon notebooks. We also have a variety of school notebooks. If you're familiar with the work of our librarian emeritus, Tom Knowles, you might be familiar with his essay on and checklist of Harvard school notebooks. So students would copy their own school notebooks and pass them around as well to other students, or file them in the libraries. And speaking of copies of things, we also have examples of Scribal Publication. There are many works, some correspondence, some complete volumes of Scribal Publication, and these were works produced in manuscript, usually in multiple copies, and passed around for members of the community to read. This happens to be a case about a pig. And if you're interested in that, we can maybe talk about it a little bit later. We also have things like government records. So this is an important volume in AAS's history, but also in the history of New England. It's the Council for New England Records from the 1620s. The Council for New England was the governing body of New England, and they sort of controlled trade, they controlled land distribution, and especially as we get into the 17th century, the issue of land distribution becomes more and more important, and led to a lot of military conflicts with indigenous populations. And just one thing, I can't really show it, but we also have a collection of maps and surveys and manuscript. And so when land was sold to various residents, and I don't really want to hold this up, but I'll just put it in front of me. This is typical kind of land survey from the I believe this is from the 1650s in Billerica. And so you see many surveys produced in this period. You see survey after survey with plots of land. And one of the things I really love about looking at these surveys is you'll see, notes of like the big oak tree or a big pile of rocks, sort of determining the boundaries of people's plots of land. So it's a great resource too for people doing history of the environment. But Meredith, would you like to say other things about manuscripts more generally in the 17th century?
Yeah, so what Ashley has shown you is a range of what we might call manuscript genres, right? So the genre would sometimes dictate the shape, the form that it takes, the kinds of information that's recorded. And something that I've been thinking about for the past couple years is other ways to think about manuscripts in ways that we can kind of go even beyond that transcribable content. And one is to think not only about genre, but to think about function in particular ways. So for example, the Russell sermon notebooks that I just showed you might have what we might call an accumulation function, right? Or a diary would have this kind of function where you sort of write in it over time, it slowly accumulates. And some of and that's actually one of my favorite genres, in part because it is temporally complicated, right? It's an object that's kept over time. And so the use and the goal of the object might change slightly over time. Or as we saw with that little Pynchon notebook, your sermon notebook is a good place to put Greek vocabulary into. And they can also form sort of palimpsests, especially if an object moves around within a family or through generations. And so we can see a kind of a layering of different intentions and ideas and interpretations of what the text means over time. Mm-hmm. Another function we could think about would be a preservation function. And I think Ashley has a really good example of that with the John Hull letter book. That is not actual letters, but it's copies of letters, right? So it's a manuscript object which is meant simply to preserve. And it may have accumulated a bit over time, right? But the idea is that this is something for preservation. So we could think, for example, about the Kerwin letter that Ashley showed us first as a kind of a preservation manuscript, right? It's trying to preserve a particular story of King Philip's War, in the way that there's also a preservation function with the sermon notebooks, right? They're trying to preserve an ephemeral speech act. But I think it's important to remember also that manuscripts can have what I guess I would call something like agent functions, when the manuscript itself is not merely preserving information, or trying to accumulate information, but it's actually acting to do something. I have an example right here. This is a print object. It's a mail-in ballot, right? But what I will do is I will make this a manuscript object at some point by filling in circles. That then becomes a manuscript that has agency to do something, to affect something in the world. I'll also need to sign it. And if I don't sign it, the agent function of that manuscript isn't going to work. I bring this up not only to remind you to vote on or before November 3rd, but just to suggest the way that we still are very invested in the agent function of manuscripts. In other words, different states have different laws about signing certain kinds of documents related to elections, but we still put primacy on sort of agent function. So here's why I think that this kind of thinking about not just genres of manuscripts, but also functions of manuscripts is helpful, because it can allow us to do certain kinds of witnessing and recovery work in unwitnessed manuscript collections. To go back to the example that Ashley began with, you know, the letter from Neuman, no relation, the letter from Neuman that's describing these violent acts of the King Philip's War, and inserts a piece of this letter from James Printer, which is no longer extant. So what that letter is trying to do is something like a preservation function. It is trying to preserve and therefore insist on a particular interpretation of a war and its violences. One of the things that it attempts to preserve, almost as if it's a tiny little letter book, it preserves that little bit from James Printer. But if we think about the original non-extant letter that James Printer writes, which, as Ashley points out and as Lisa Brooks points out, is a kind of an agent function. It is an act of resistance, right? It is a very powerful manuscript agent. By incorporating it into this letter, Neuman essentially tries to shift the function of James Printer's letter from its agent function to a mere preservation, and therefore to reinterpret the agency inherent in that lost letter by James Printer. Anyway, just suggesting that when you start to think about manuscripts and play with them, to play with the ways that genre of manuscripts might overlap, but also the way that function might overlap and change and become ambiguous, because it's often the ways that those different functions and different genres rub up against each other that we can expand the meaning even beyond that transcribable content. All right, back to you, Ashley.
Thank you, Meredith. So if we can shift back to the dot cam, we are going to now talk about deeds. And this is a type of document that has, and again, it just takes a moment to shift to the dot cam. This is one of those documents that actually does something. So we mentioned John Hull earlier, John Hull's letter book. And again, just to remind you, Hull was a mint master and treasurer in Massachusetts who also owned quite a bit of land. And this comes from a collection of his papers that relate to, or rather not his personal papers, but a collection of papers from our Boston, Massachusetts collection that relate to land in Cotton Hill in Boston, which is now part of Government Center, if you're familiar with that area. This deed relates to land in Sherborne, Mass. And it's from 1682. And I'm just going to read a little bit of the deed so that you can get a sense of the language. And I won't read much of it just because it gets a little bit tedious after a while. To all Christian people to whom this present deed of sale shall come, greeting know ye that we, Wabin, John Awasamug, Peter Ephraim, Payambaho, John Magus, Andrew Pitamy, and Great John, Indian natives and natural descendants of the ancient inhabitants and proprietors of the lands lying in and about the town of Sherborne, etc., etc. And they go on to say, that they've sold this land in Sherborne for £22, current money of New England, to John Hull and others. And they say these several tracts or parcels of land herein to them granted the receipt whereof we do hereby acknowledge to our full content and satisfaction have granted, bargained, sold, released, and fiefed and confirmed. All of these very legalistic words and very legalistic language, each type of, each word within a deed has a different significance. But basically what this deed is saying is that the price of the land was negotiated, the land was legally or is legally being sold to Hull and the others who are on this deed, and that with the enfeoffment that the land can be passed down from generation to generation from those who purchased the land. So you can also see sort of the bottom here. I'll just try to make this visible so you can see some of the more interesting part of this deed. Okay, I hope that's up there. Yes, you can. So what's happening here in terms of the transcribable content? You probably heard sort of the beginning of the deed says, "Know ye that we Wabin." Wabin is a Nipmuc leader who appears in a number of deeds in the summer and the spring of 1682. This comes after a 1681 petition to the General Court on behalf of the Nipmuc tribes that land that was throughout Natick area, Sherborne area, Wabin says in this petition to the General Court that the land was not legally sold to the English. And so Wabin asks that the land in this area be legally sort of transferred. And so a lot of these deeds that pop up in 1682 are related to that petition. So this deed also, I think, is really important. It includes another type of text of resistance. And again, I hope you can see this here. This is a memorandum that is signed by Great John, his mark. It's right near this area of the memorandum. So perhaps John was the one who came up with this idea. But this memorandum says that it is agreed before the signing and sealing hereof that, and what they say is that the Indians or the Nipmucs who are selling this land are allowed to fish and fowl on the land, which is, again, unusual. It's not a complete transfer of land. The Nipmucs still retain the right to fish and fowl. So again, this text of resistance is present. And Kayla, did you have a question? Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were looking. So beyond that transcribable content, we have the same kind of, we have the ink smudges you can see throughout. We have the same type of ink being used on this document as the other documents. We have the seals here. These are paper seals that are typical of this period. You'll see that Wabin, John Awasimov, Peter Ephraim all have signed their marks, but they certainly didn't have seals available to them. So these are likely, again, it's a little bit difficult to see on the .cam, but these are likely generic seals that were used by a clerk of court or some kind of clerk who was involved in the signing and sealing of the deed. And you can sort of see the impressions here. A piece of wax would have been put down and a piece of paper over this and then everything pressed down. You can also see here, again, this is transcribable content, but this deed was recorded in the Suffolk County Registry of Deeds. And you'll see Isaac Addington here signs his name. He was the Register of Deeds during this period. And you'll see the book, the 12th book, page 264 of the Suffolk Deeds. So if you were to go to Suffolk County Register of Deeds and look at the old 17th century deeds, you would find a copy of this in that book. And then we also have the two witnesses here, Samuel Gookin and John Grout, who were in the presence when this document was signed and sealed. And the reason why deeds are so important, I mean, going back to the work of Francis Jennings, I'll actually leave this up on the .cam so you can take a look. Going back to the work of Francis Jennings almost 50 years ago, and again, more recently, we keep bringing up Lisa Brooks, but her work is very important for 17th century New England history. Deeds have had a pretty significant place in the history of the 17th century relations between indigenous populations and the English. And a deed, as Meredith said, this is very much a thing that is being done. This is a deed done. This isn't just a material artifact recording something. When this deed was signed and sealed and witnessed, the transfer of land happened. This is a legal action when the sealing and the signing when the sealing and the signing happened. And so again, there are many deeds throughout our collections. We know that there is much more that we can explore with these documents. And it's important that you remember, you know, a lot of times when you're researching deeds, you have to work with multiple sources. So we have deeds at AAS. You might have to go to the Registry of Deeds. You might also have to go to other institutions that have, for instance, Harvard has the petition. Actually, it might be the Mass Archives that has the petition of Waban to the Mass government. And so you have to work with a number of different institutions and a number of different resources to understand land transfers throughout the 17th century. But now that we have a lot digitized, that work becomes more possible. And Meredith, over to you for more on digitized manuscripts, and also I think one final object.
Meredith is muted.
I'm no longer muted. I'm also not very good at the chat function, but I just wanted to say to John Overholt, indeed, it's always funny when we have to print out electronic documents to sort of sign them. But I'm also thinking about that deed that Ashley just showed us and how people are signing by proxy, right? And then also to Eric's comment about ceremonial function, I think it's interesting to think about ways that ceremony can suggest sort of a gestural action or deed, whereas in some cases the ceremony itself might have had agency. And again, here we have sort of like the primacy of the written document, which might go beyond other kinds of agreements that this written document then kind of overwrites, I guess. All right. I think the last object that we wanted to look at is because A, it's one of the weirdest books that I've ever seen, and B, because this is just a small reminder to everybody that manuscripts don't just live in the manuscripts area of an archive. Sometimes manuscripts live in printed books, such as in this Semmelband, which is to say it's a collection of about 5 different titles by the English theologian Hugh Broughton, all sort of bound together into this one volume. So a lot of the material in here is print, but we can also notice in it some reader annotation, right? And this is something that many of us do today, is write little notes in the margin, right? To kind of amplify and to mark out our own reading experience of a particular text. I encourage my students to do this, for example. Some of them are hesitant, some of them love to do it. But we also see in this collection that an illustration might also be annotated. And here we have a heavily annotated, these are sort of some emblems that got annotated. In particular, I love this, this sort of historical kingdoms, the monarchies. So somebody has gone in to supplement the kind of the illustration to make it explicit, like this part is Babel, this part is the Alexander monarchy. And it's been heavily annotated, in a sense, sort of adding a utility for the individual, or potentially for the owner who then buys this book object later on, as I think a member of the Mather family did. No blank page is safe, of course. In a well-annotated print book, we might find some pretty complex notes amplifying and expanding on the content of the print itself. And we should remember that there is always a sort of permeability between the imprint and the manuscript. And it's probably a little bit of a fiction that our systems of cataloging, our systems of archive tend to separate things out. So in this case, we have, I forget the name of this imprint, Ashley, but on the left facing page, is this the Consent of Scripture?
I'll pull up the title page.
Yeah, so this is a copy of Consent of Scripture by Hugh Broughton. But as we go in, we see that after a certain leaf, part of the printed text is, part of the printed leaves are missing. And they have been supplied, as you can see on the right, in manuscript. All right. So then there's a question about what is this copy of the consent of Scripture? Is it a print object? Is it a manuscript object? Clearly, it's a hybrid. And if you could go to the very last sermon. We might even have, as these sort of book objects are kind of handcrafted by individual book owners, you see on the left the end of a print imprint, but on the right you see bound with it a manuscript copy of a sermon preached, etc., which Ashley and I don't think exists in an imprint form, but in a sense it acts as its own book. And the fact that it is bound together with these other print and hybrid books of Hugh Broughton suggests that perhaps in the 17th century, that certain book owners were maybe a bit indifferent to having a manuscript, to having a print, to having a hybrid object. It's about building out the library. And some of the fine distinctions that we might make between the print object and the manuscript object might not have really made a lot of sense to original book owners. And I'll also cite the work of Jeffrey Todd Knight, who thinks a lot about book owners as book creators. Mm-hmm. And I think this circles back to the idea of the manuscript, that if we look at this Sammelband, this kind of collection of titles by Hugh Broughton all bound together, we see that the book owner who did annotation, the person who brought these all together, in a sense is creating the book alongside Hugh Broughton himself. Thank you, Ashley.
Sure.
Well, I think that we're going to try to start wrapping up so that we can save a little bit of time for questions and answers, because I see that's filled up. I'm going to say one thing very quickly, though, about the times where we are and thinking about manuscripts. Because we're in a pandemic, I'm sitting here with a Sharpie in front of me and a glass of water talking about manuscripts in ways that I couldn't possibly in a rare book room. I'm having that bittersweet experience right now teaching a print culture class that was supposed to be physically at the AAS, but instead we're working entirely digitally. But these disparities of access, depending on your geographic location, are not unique to the pandemic. And so for the past few years, I've also been trying to think a lot about ways that everybody can engage manuscript culture through really excellent digitization projects. Jumping a little ahead into the 18th century, for example, if you haven't seen the Samson Occam collections at Dartmouth College, I believe Kayla has a bunch of digitization links that we're going to share with you. That is a really excellent resource. So if you teach early American literature or history and you want to teach Samson Occam's short autobiographical narrative, you can actually have students look at the actual manuscript as well. And I will say that something like Anne Bradstreet's Andover Manuscript, which is at the Houghton Library. Hi, John Overholt. There's an excellent digitization, the link's in the chat, to the Anne Bradstreet Andover Manuscript. For the past 3 years or so, I have been teaching the manuscript in my introductory American literature survey class. So it is entirely possible to ask undergraduates to read a manuscript, to understand it not just as text, but as an object with all kinds of familial and added values, all different kinds of manuscript functions that play together. Some of them can read the writing, some of them struggle a little bit with it, but they come to understand that kind of complex interplay of the manuscript in this early period. And I would encourage everyone out there to use some of these excellent digital resources that are out there. Thanks so much. And I think we have some time for Q&A now.
All right, thank you both. So I'm just going to kind of pitch the Q&A to Ashley and Meredith. There is still time to upvote if you want to go through the questions as you see them and upvote ones that you like. So we're going to start with this one. Was there a standard shorthand notation system, or was it unique to each writer?
So there were a couple of standard systems, but Meredith, would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, as Ashley said, there's a couple of standard systems, and you could get print books that tell you how to do this kind of short writing. But what I see most of the time is people adapting things to their particular uses. So if you encounter shorthand in a manuscript, it's very likely to be an adaptation of one of those available systems. The other thing that you sometimes see is not necessarily shorthand throughout, but somebody might have picked up a particular shorthand for a particular word, right? So if you see shorthand being used for a particular word where it's mostly written out in English, but just a particular word, that's often an indication that that word is used so commonly. God, for example, is very frequently shorthanded, or other very common words like that. So you can get a sense of the sort of the urgency and the frequency of words as well. But again, those systems as well are usually kind of adapted and become pretty idiosyncratic to the individual shorthand writer. I don't read shorthand myself, though.
When was the rule against women writing overturned, if it ever was?
I don't know that it was ever overturned, but we know, again, if you go to the Bradstreet manuscript, we know that women did learn to write. They just did not receive formal training from a writing master. And so we had a variety of writing masters who were itinerant for the most part, traveling throughout Connecticut and New England, teaching the more formal hand. So a kind of secretary hand or a business hand would have been taught. And women did not have access to that training. Again, when that changed or when that was overturned, I'm not entirely certain, but again, women were learning to write, they just were not formally trained.
I'm going to put in another plug for the Andover Manuscript because you can see that Anne Bradstreet writes, like many women of the day who did write, would write in italic form, basically. So if you can read cursive today, you can probably read Anne Bradstreet's writing. At the point in the manuscript when she dies and her son takes over the manuscript, he has many more features of secretary hand. So you can see in the manuscript book where the kind of the function of the manuscript changes, but it changes along with that handwriting style, and it implicates the sort of the relative, the difference in the training that the mother and the son have had in writing.
I'm going to combine two questions here because they're sort of related. Can you talk a little bit about waste paper, or the small scraps of paper used for notes, messages, etc., and combine with that, how scarce was paper in this period? Was it produced in New England? Was it all imported?
So maybe second part of the question first. Paper wasn't produced in New England until quite late. Some of the first paper mills in the colonies appeared in Pennsylvania in the very late part of the 17th century. So much of the paper that was being used was imported primarily from Europe. A lot of the sort of rougher paper maybe used for printing could have been imported from England, but most of the finer writing paper was imported from Western Europe. In terms of the small scraps of paper, Meredith, I don't know if you want to say anything, but I can say you do see these small scraps used for receipts. We don't see as much survival of small scraps from the 17th century, unfortunately, so we don't have a lot of, as we do from the 19th century, we don't have a lot of people's grocery lists or examples of accounting that you see much later. We do have scraps and waste used in binding oftentimes, or in spine linings. I don't have any examples here, but you will see, sort of every piece of of paper used. And one thing that I've noticed, and Meredith, you've probably noticed this too, when you're looking at correspondence from England, oftentimes only one side of a page was used. Oftentimes in the colonies, you'll see both sides of a page used for like correspondence, for instance, which I think speaks to the general scarcity of writing paper in the New England colonies.
There's also, I mean, scraps of paper just are less likely to survive. But you can get a sense of the kind of scrap writing that happens when you look at a notebook. For example, we saw some examples where, you know, somebody writes Greek vocabulary notes, or there's a little bit of accounting down there, right? So there's a sense that you can do scrap writing within a bound book, and that kind of preserves the kind of things that might be those little ephemeral, like one-offs. And it includes things like pen trials, right? So you want to see if the ink is in your quill is flowing correctly. Just one more thing is that because of the relative scarcity of paper, you often get these kind of palimpsest phenomenon. For example, a letter to John Cotton that says one thing on one side, and on the back of it has notes that he's writing for a sermon. Right, so you can kind of get a sense of how ideas and these manuscripts sort of emerge over time. So in a sense, when they remain in the context of reuse, you can do other levels of interpretation on it. But every time I look at something like that big Russell notebook and I see all those, you know, leaves that were partially torn out, I really wish that I could have the scrap of paper and see, you know, what did somebody tear out of this book and what did they write on that scrap that no longer exists to us.
I'm just going to make a side note here. Eric Stojkovic has suggested for a good book for answering questions about when colonial laws regarding writing and reading changed is Jennifer Monaghan's Learning to Read and Write in Colonial America.
Yeah, Jennifer Monaghan's book is a fantastic resource for that and colonial, reading and writing more broadly.
Okay, next question. You touched on the difference in meaning interpretation between print and text and manuscript, print text and manuscript text. How do these differences extend to studying original versus digital copies of manuscripts?
Wow.
And also, thank you so much for this wonderful talk.
Oh, is that? I think that's Mark Kelly.
It is Mark Kelly. Yes.
Yep. Meredith, would you? This is sort of more in your wheelhouse than mine, I think.
Well, I'd actually like to start by kind of drawing your attention to a couple of comments in the chat. Gretchen Atkins
that's Mark Kelly,
kind of talks about
Mark Kelly, not Mike Kelly. Sorry.
Gretchen Atkins talks about the haptic qualities, right? So if you can touch a manuscript, it makes a difference. It just does. There's something different about it. That said, there's a lot that can be done with digitized. Eric also kind of talks about these other issues of disparity that come up when we're thinking about different forms of digital access. One of the reasons why I like digitizations like the Andover Manuscript and what they've done with the OCOM collection at Dartmouth is that the quality is so good that you can kind of see things like chain lines and wire lines and the paper itself. So to some extent, you can, if you have some familiarity with the way a blank book is put together, for example, you could go through and from a digitized manuscript figure out that a leaf is missing. Or you could go through a manuscript and figure out that there is a different paper cover, in a sense, over a gathering within. So there's a lot of evidence that you can kind of draw from those digitized resources, but to have a kind of a reference point with the real thing and kind of to be able to figure out how a sheet of paper is folded, right, in space and time to make a gathering for a book, whether that's printed or manuscript, like a blank book, is really helpful as a reference point.
Next question is, could you outline some of the markers of the different hands you mentioned, secretary, italic, etc.? How do you idea hand, and were certain hands taught to certain people at certain times? Which you've touched on a little bit.
We have like a minute for this question, Meredith. Meredith actually done workshops in the past where we talk more specifically about this. We realized in a 1-hour webinar, we did not have enough time to get into the details of these different letter forms, but there are some fantastic resources. People like Anthony Petty and others have written great works on identifying secretary and italic letter forms that you might want to check out if you're interested. Maybe we can do another webinar that gets into other types of issues with early manuscripts. Meredith, I don't know if you wanted to, and just in terms of who was trained in these types of hands, again, we said primarily men were trained to write in the secretary hand, women writing in the italic. Most famously, I think that's brought up repeatedly, is Elizabeth, the Queen of England, wrote in italic. And so her handwriting is incredibly easy to read, but if you're looking at any sort of scrivener's book or any correspondence from men from this period, you're likely going to encounter the secretary hand, and it's a completely different alphabet from the one that we're more familiar with.
When I'm trying to introduce students to 17th century handwriting, and they can really take to it, I think, surprisingly well, I often use a resource. The National Archives in the UK has kind of these self-guided tutorials, and it actually starts, I think, in the 16th century. It's got examples of Elizabeth's writing, for example. What I've found, and this feels more anecdotal, I'm not sure, but it feels like some of the hard and fast ways that you can identify something about the writer based on the letter form is a little bit more hard and fast if you're looking at English examples. When you get to New England, there is something that changes about the availability of certain kinds of formal education, particularly with secretary hand. So very frequently, I feel like I see, university educated men, university in New England educated men that have kind of a hybrid between secretary and italic. Mm-hmm. And I kind of feel like Simon Bradstreet's handwriting is a bit like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you'll see Simon Bradstreet's signature on many deeds from this period. Oh, we were a little bit over, I guess. So I guess we haven't really talked about how to conclude, but we have many more questions. We hope to be able to get to them. I don't know if Kayla, you can keep those questions. So maybe if you have questions, you can always email me. If I can answer them, I will. And thank you for coming. Thank you for attending. We were so happy to be able to do this and hope to do many more.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to put
and all the good chat discussion.
Exactly.
I'm going to put Ashley's email in the chat for any questions you might want to follow up on.
Yep.
And hopefully that will help with that. And if you want to save the chat to retain all the information, all the links, you can go down to the bottom and it has the 3 dots, and there you can save a transcription of the chat, so you can go back to that for reference later.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for sharing resources and saying hello. We're so happy to see you all.
Thank you.